This is CyberSound, your simplified and fundamentals-focused source for all things cybersecurity.
Welcome to CyberSound. I'm your host, Jason Pufall, joined as always by our CEO, Michael Grandy.
Great to be here.
And we've got a special guest, Fred Purdue, who's the Managing Director of Mergers and Acquisitions at West Monroe. Welcome, Fred.
Thank you for having me.
So, I've had the pleasure to know Fred for several years now. We've worked together through the Renaissance Executive Forum, REF group in Connecticut, which is a great peer group. And Fred came to that group originally as the principal owner of Axiom Technology Group. And I've really relied on his guidance and advice through the last couple of years. He's sort of a man for all seasons. He really brings a lot to the table with technology and security and a lot of different his business acumen. So it's really great to have you join us, and I'm pleased that you're here and you've got your new gig, which is fantastic. And maybe introduce yourself a little bit, share a little bit about West Monroe and your role.
Yeah, absolutely. So West Monroe is a global business technology consulting company. We're headquartered in Chicago, but I'm actually out of our New York office. We've been around for 22 years, and we sort of combine a traditional management consulting approach with a foundation in digital technology. Work with a wide variety of upper mid-market and lower enterprise companies across a great number of different industries, practices, et cetera. It's a heck of an organization, and I'm really excited to have joined it.
That's great. And your focus there?
So I'm on our mergers and acquisitions team. So my primary responsibility is helping to support private equity firms through the ownership lifecycle. Whether it's, they're looking at an organization and they want to understand what are the technology implications if we purchase this, through we've bought the company, now what do we do with it? We're positioning it for exit, et cetera. As well as sometimes just what's the state of industry X, right? So recently you've done a bunch of talks on what's the state of the MSP industry. What's it look like? What are the people out there? What are the platforms? What do great companies look like? What do bad companies look like? Just trying to help them understand this space as they start to identify opportunities for acquisition.
So in that acquisition space, so we're more in that mid-market space, involved in the IT aspect specifically, typically, right, of the M&A process. What are some of the key things from an integration standpoint that you see, right? Due diligence that needs to occur up front. Any technologies you'd say, hey, if we see these as an immediate red flag or anything like that?
Well, the question really becomes very industry specific very quick. So we're actually focused around what we call value creation teams, which are industry focused teams, because how I might answer that question for a healthcare company is very different from how we might answer it for a financial services or a manufacturing company.
Right.
Likewise, how we might answer that question for a $50 million company is very differently from how we'd answer it for a $1 billion company. But generally speaking, you're looking for organizations that can articulate a strategy around what they have, why they're making those choices. You're looking for people that are running on current and supported platforms. And you're looking for people that are at least asking themselves questions around what can I do with my data? What does my strategy look like? What does my life cycle look like? In a modern landscape, for example, you're going to be asking a lot of people like, what's your data and analytics strategy look like? What's your artificial intelligence strategy look like? And sometimes having a well-founded answer to those questions is more important than what the answer necessarily is. Okay. I mean, it's like when you guys are doing a cybersecurity assessment on somebody, you're going to go through like a cybersecurity framework, maybe NIST, CMMC, something like that. And you're going to ask them a series of questions, and you want to are they going to give you an articulate answer? Can they justify why they've got this old platform in place? Or are they just going to go like, oh, that's old, we didn't even realize.
Right, we don't upgrade things.
We need to understand this more.
Yeah. And, this is the integration costs. You're looking at sort of diversity of different types of companies, obviously from a private equity perspective, but even if it's a, sort of one-to-one transaction, is that become part of the financial model when they're sort of looking at, potential risk or expense, integrating systems, what exactly has to be considered? Obviously on the smaller end, you go for efficiencies and you look for sort of the low-hanging fruit. But when you're combining large entities and you've got a lot of considerations, I'm sure that's definitely got to calculate in.
Well, it really needs to calculate in whether you're large or small. One of the common mistakes that smaller organizations do, especially when they're doing like private transaction, is they don't ask some of those questions around what are our cost synergies going to look like? What are our cost dis-synergies going to look like? What are our integration costs going to look like? And they merge or they acquire another company, and then they go to integrate it and they turn it over to their execution, their operations teams. And they say, great, we bought a company, go integrate it. These people haven't done it before. They've got day jobs. You haven't accounted for the time and energy it's going to take to do that. So all of a sudden you've got teams that are already running at full sprint that now have a second job. So we really encourage people, whether you're going through a formal process or it's a private transaction, a merger of equals or something like that, you absolutely want to look at those things as part of the purchase and diligence process. Because if nothing else, think about it this way, right? If you're buying a house and you have a homeowner's inspection that says the roof's got to be replaced, you can either replace that roof as part of the purchase, roll it in the mortgage. You can tell the seller, hey, this thing needs a new roof. Or you could buy the house, close on it, realize it needs a new roof then, and now you get to pay for a new roof. And you don't want to get stuck that way, and neither does a company.
You know, in your experience, I feel like the logical answer is going to be yes. But I'm interested if there's any sort of, interesting situations that you've seen on, diligence exposing some, substantial risk during an acquisition, and sort of what are the consequences of that outside of financial. It feels like there could be so many different variations of, either scuttling a deal or really changing the mechanics of what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the entire gambit and everything in the middle. I've gone into companies that have cybersecurity stacks where I'm like, this is really neat. I can't believe you figured out how to do this. You got to keep in mind, some of the companies we look at might be cybersecurity companies themselves as well. Yeah. So we've gone in and run diligences on large MSSPs, cybersecurity providers, et cetera. On the other end of the spectrum, we've been in organizations where we look at it, we're like, we're not sure how the building's not on fire. And honestly, it could be, and we're not sure you'd notice. We went into one large organization that had large amounts of data on minors. And when we looked at their landscape, tons of ancient technology that hasn't been properly segmented, hasn't been properly secured, and they had very little intelligence in terms of what was going on in the environment. So yeah, we had to have a conversation with the buyer of, hey guys, you got some real risk in here. And this isn't the kind of risk that it's like, hey, it's going to cost us some money or downtime. It's not even the kind of risk that you're going to show up and find out the company's shut down for a couple of days. This is the kind of risk where your name's going to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal if you don't pay attention to this.
Yeah. It basically inheriting
an
incident.
We just leaked data on 7 million children. That's going to end up in the news. You don't want that. And they had to go back to the seller and say, hey guys, we need to adjust purchase price for this because we're going to fix all this stuff. And by the way, we're going to make special insurance on this, and you've got to pay for it because if we find something out in 6 months or a year, we're not going to be on the hook for that. You guys are. So they put tail insurance on it to make sure that they're covered. So there were a number of financial implications to that because there were a whole bunch of risk and security implications to that.
How often, out of curiosity, do you see insurance brought to bear in a discussion like that? Is that an edge case? Is that fairly common?
Well, cybersecurity insurance and general liability insurance is something we kind of always look for, not necessarily purely from the insurance and risk perspective, because there's folks that are doing that as well, but we want to understand, what does it look like? What do your policies look like? Do you have reasonably appropriate policies in place from a technology and security perspective? But there's also a process, at least in a lot of larger transactions, called reps and warranties, where they're underwriting the debt. And that absolutely has cybersecurity and technology elements to it. It's one of the reasons why once upon a time, cybersecurity was something that only some PE firms looked at and only in some circumstances. Now you can't close on a company if you have not done a cybersecurity assessment. It'd be like trying to buy a house that you've never done a home inspection on. The mortgage company's going to look at that and go like, yeah, we're not giving you a mortgage on this thing because you can't prove that the house isn't going to fall down. Well, companies require that now as well when you're buying companies.
So how much of a benefit is it maybe to you as you're evaluating, or maybe to the business in sale, if they've got a certain security compliance, right? Like SOC or CMMC, or they've gone through a process. They can demonstrate that they've got certain controls in place. Clearly, that makes your job easier. Is there an appreciable benefit for a company at the time of sale?
Yeah. So first off, if you're going to sell your house, you're going to try to make sure your house looks good, right? You're going to do some curb work. You're going to try to make sure everything's painted, it's clean, the house is picked up. You're going to do the same thing in a company, right? So there is something that our team's actually doing more and more of this these days. It's called the sell side advisory. And it's sort of the management presentation for your technology stack. So it lets you say, here's the technology we have, here's the security and risk posture we have, here's why we have it. It lets you tell the story, and it lets you control what that story looks like. And that makes it a lot easier to position the company for sale because it's lower risk, and lower risk means that they can pay more for it. Likewise, on the buyer side, having a really good picture of what that cybersecurity risk matters, because if you go in and you look at it and you say, hey guys, we're missing all this stuff from a cybersecurity perspective, and that has an impact on like the run rate, that has an impact on the budget for the company. Well, if you move the budget of a company by $1 million, when you buy companies, you buy it based on a multiple. If that multiple was 10, for example, and you just moved the budget by $1 million, you just took $10 million off the purchase price. So that can have really big impacts, right? So if you're selling the company, you don't want to see that happen. And if you're buying the company, you want to understand that because you don't want to be the guy who pays for that miss. You want to make sure that you understood that going in, it came into account in your financial model, if you were.
The sell side advising is interesting. I hadn't actually considered that as such an element of this, but doing your due diligence, getting yourself, make yourself look more attractive ahead of time, right? Smart business.
Yeah, it seems though that, and I don't know, I don't have any data behind this. You actually may know more about this for sure. Has there been a radical increase in transactions, just quantity of transactions over the last 5 years versus the prior 5? Does it ebb and flow? Obviously low interest rates contributed to a lot of activity over a set period of time. But I think, and we've had this conversation, there's still a very active market in MSPs, for instance. Technology services is still a very hot area. But are there any other factors that feed into it that you can shed any light on?
So, that's a pretty big question, right? If you look at the overall trend, especially in private equity, it's been growing pretty substantially over the last, call it 10 to 15 years. The private markets are a really great way for banks, pension funds, organizations with large amounts of capital. They're finding it's a lot more effective to deploy it in private equity than it is to try to deploy it in the stock market or something like that. During COVID, you saw actually a big spike in purchases because all of a sudden you had lots of companies that were distressed. Distressed companies sell for a lot less. So it's a great opportunity for anybody that has cash to go out and buy it or to go out and buy other organizations. In 22-23, you saw a bit of a dip. Interest rates were spiking up. A lot of questions about what the economy looks like. Fourth quarter of last year, you started to see it pick up. We're actually seeing a fair amount of activity in first and second quarter of 2024. And it does look like it's ramping up a fair amount.
I'm sure it's company specific, certainly by the size, but how long does due diligence actually take typically? Is that a 3-month activity? Is that a 12-month activity?
So due diligence has lots of different steps in it, right? In the very beginning, there's some basic information. You're going to do financial diligence. You're going to do quality of earnings checks. You're going to do some legal due diligence. That process can take a while. Then you typically get to hey, we've got a pretty good picture. We're collecting initial bids. You pick a smaller group of bidders that you want to look at. If you're selling the organization, you might go under a letter of intent. That's when you start doing some of your deeper levels of diligence. And IT diligence is typically in there. It is not a long process. We typically get a couple of weeks to do it if we're lucky. Because you're not doing the deep dive diligence until you're pretty confident that you're going to buy this thing, right? Because you don't want to spend a ton of money on something you may not buy. It's like when you're doing an inspection on a house, it's either a house you've put an offer in on or a house you're about to put an offer in on. You don't walk into a house and be like, this looks kind of nice, let's do an inspection. Yeah. You don't want to spend the money.
Right.
So the same thing is true when you're doing due diligence. All in, the process from the time you start talking to somebody to the time you close a deal could be 6 to 9 months. But it goes in these sort of cycles. And there is a mad sprint in the last 30 to 45 days of 100 different people trying to talk with the business owners or business leadership to try to compile and complete various forms of due diligence.
We've talked a little bit about process there. We've talked earlier about sort of integration, some of the signs that you're looking at or the areas that you're keying in on. Let's maybe spend a minute on red flags and things that sort of really jump out and potentially could cause major concerns in different deals. If you have anything specific that you'd like to point out, I think in doing some of our research, obviously there's disclosures that could have been made at some point due to a breach. You've got, for public companies, there's different filings to the SEC requirements. I'm sure there's a variety of others. Yeah.
So there are, like I said, we've seen a really big gambit. I think what's critical to keep in mind is that when you're going through a deal or a transaction, there's lots of stuff in motion. So there's a lot of attention that can get pulled on a company when it's going through a process like that, right? So what you're looking for, and red flags mean something specific to us, by the way. So, but what you're looking for is things that could become a material risk very quickly, right? So there's a difference between this organization has a bunch of old technology, they really need to replace it, they really need to look at it, they've got some unpatched vulnerabilities. What you're looking for is things that can create imminent harm. Do they have an effective EDR strategy in place? Do they have an effective MFA strategy in place? Those are two things you really want to see because a lot of attention is going to show up on an organization. Now, you're also like, have you experienced a breach? You're going to ask a lot of questions like that. And when I want to be a little careful how I answer this because there might be things we look at where we say, this is an issue. You need to address this, but this is like a first 100 days issue or a year one issue. Yeah. Red flags are like a flag on the play. Everybody's got to stop. We need to talk about this. They're actually pretty darn rare. Okay. And they usually come off of there's something significantly wrong with a financial one. Someone's missing lots of stuff. Someone hasn't accounted for something significant. When you think about carve-outs and things like that, where there's lots of shared services, we might come back and be like, by the way, when y'all built the IT budget, all this stuff was coming from parent. Nobody ever actually accounted for this. We just moved your operating model by $4 million, $5 million a year. That has a huge impact on purchase price. Everybody's going to stop. But there will be times when cybersecurity can pop up in there. And it can pop up from sort of two different perspectives. One is the obvious, hey, is there something that's so blatant in here that it's going to come up in the reps and warranties call and we need to have a really good answer for it or we're not going to get our underwriting done. The second is a bit on the less obvious side. And that's that in this kind of a deal cycle, especially as you start getting towards close, there's lots of moving pieces. There's legal pieces that are moving, there's regulatory, there's financial, there's HR, there's technology. There's lots of change, lots of fast movement, and not everybody knows what's going on. There's also a lot of money in play. That's a great time for an attacker to attack you. So we have absolutely seen attackers target companies where there is an announcement, because frequently see in the news like so-and-so's announced an intention to buy so-and-so. And they're planning on closing the transaction in that. So that's because some companies have what's called a sign to close period. And it's sort of like between you've got an accepted offer on a house and you close on the house, where you've got to do that process. An attacker sees that and goes, lots of uncertainty, lots of questions, lots of people that are overwhelmed, lots of money.
Right. And lots of conversations in between people.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So people are talking, you don't know who anybody is.
You don't know who exactly. Requests are coming from a lot of different areas. You don't necessarily
know who everybody is.
Yeah.
And kind of like when you're buying a house, right? You get that piece of paper that's like, well, here's what the attorneys get, here's what the agent gets, and here's what the seller gets, and here's what the bank gets, and here's what property gets. The same thing happens when you buy a company. It's called flow of funds. And if somebody gets their hands on that and can change even like one or two routing numbers on that thing, then they can get away with a very large amount of money very quickly that they're not likely going to get caught. So just like when you go to sell that house now and they make you sign a piece of paper in the closing that says you have verified the routing numbers. If you got them wrong, it's not their problem. You're accepting liability. They're not doing that out of an abundance of caution. They're doing it because it's gotten people burned a lot. And we've seen companies get hit and close like that as well, either through sort of some of the traditional invoice fraud, but we've also seen people actually intercede and interject themselves into flow of funds. And when that happens, y'all are having a really bad day.
And staying on the house analogy then, is that process as chaotic as buying a house? Because oftentimes you're not getting your your payouts and everything until the day of, maybe the hour of. Yeah. Is same kind of experience when merging or buying companies?
A lot bigger.
Yeah.
There's so much that goes on. There's so many different players involved. There's so many different components to a transaction that you're always in a mad sprint.
Always.
And there's no way around it. It's the nature of the beast.
Okay. Well, that was very informative.
Yeah. And so I feel like, this is one of those topics you say, well, we'll spend 15 minutes on it and give you a little bit of info, or, spend 3 days on a seminar, right?
I would imagine from, as you said, different verticals, different industries, different compliance requirements, regulatory burden. There's so many different angles to look at when considering, especially IT diligence and cybersecurity risk when it comes to M&A. So, I really appreciate you joining us today. I hope this was as enjoyable for you as it was for us, and great to share some of your knowledge.
It's always fun. Thanks for having me, Michael.
You got it.
Fred, thanks for joining. And of course, as always, right, if anybody has any questions, reach out to us. We are happy to field them. We can get Fred back on if there's interest. And from that, as always, we hope you took something valuable from this. So thank you for listening.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
We'd love to hear your feedback. Feel free to get in touch at Vancord on LinkedIn. And remember, stay vigilant, stay resilient. This has been CyberSound.